There is a span of time that should be crowded with evidence, yet remains strangely empty. Between the last hunter-gatherer camps of the Upper Paleolithic and the first settled villages of the Neolithic, thousands of years pass with little trace of continuity. Tools change abruptly, symbols disappear, entire ways of living seem to dissolve without leaving a clear record of how or why. It is not destruction that stands out in this silence, but absence. And absence, when measured carefully, becomes difficult to ignore. What happened in the years that left so little behind? Archaeologists often describe history as a layered accumulation, each generation leaving fragments atop the last. In most periods, this layering is uneven but legible. One style fades as another emerges. Techniques evolve. Beliefs transform gradually. But here, the ground tells a different story. Excavation reveals breaks rather than transitions. Layers thin unexpectedly. Cultural signals dim, then reappear altered, simplified, as if memory itself had been interrupted. This absence carries consequences. Without continuity, explanation falters. Evolutionary models expect progression or adaptation, not sudden forgetting. Knowledge, once learned, tends to persist unless actively lost. Stoneworking skills refined over millennia do not vanish easily. Symbolic expression, once integrated into ritual and identity, does not simply evaporate. And yet, across multiple regions, the record suggests precisely that. Skills regress. Artistic complexity diminishes. Long-established patterns dissolve. One possibility is collapse. Climate shifts, resource scarcity, and population stress are familiar forces. Toward the end of the last ice age, the world changed rapidly. Temperatures dropped, then rose. Ice sheets retreated. Coastlines shifted. Many species disappeared. Human groups would have been forced to adapt quickly. Migration, conflict, and loss would have followed. Under such pressure, some knowledge may have been abandoned, but even collapse leaves traces. Displacement leaves debris. Trauma leaves markers. Here, the silence feels too complete. Another explanation points toward dispersal. Small groups spreading across vast landscapes might fragment traditions. Without sustained contact, complex systems could erode. Yet this too raises questions. Fragmentation produces variation, not uniform simplification. What appears instead is a convergence toward simpler forms, as if different regions were resetting independently yet similarly. The odds of such parallel forgetting strain coincidence. This is where unease enters quietly, not as accusation, but as pattern recognition. When absence repeats, it invites attention. The archaeological record does not accuse anyone of erasure. It simply shows that something once present is no longer visible. The difficulty lies in distinguishing what was never there from what has been removed. Stone and bone preserve selectively. Wood, fiber, and voice vanish easily. Entire systems of knowledge may have relied on materials that decay without trace. If so, the silence may be misleading. The past could have been fuller than it appears. But even this generosity toward decay does not resolve the problem entirely. Some absences are structural. Settlement patterns break. Toolkits simplify. Artistic traditions cease. These are not matters of preservation alone. They reflect choices, constraints, or disruptions at the level of culture itself. To lose so much at once suggests more than gradual change. Historians are cautious around such gaps. Absence is often treated as ignorance rather than evidence. What cannot be shown is set aside. Yet silence, when consistent, becomes a form of data. It suggests that the story we expect to tell does not fit the material we have. This mismatch does not demand extraordinary explanations. It demands patience. Patience reveals that these gaps are not isolated. Similar discontinuities appear in different continents, separated by distance but aligned in time. Techniques emerge early, vanish, then reappear later with no clear lineage. Monumental buildings seems to pause, then resume in altered forms. It is as if human societies periodically lose their own momentum, restarting under new constraints. Some scholars suggest that knowledge transmission requires stability. When populations fall below a certain threshold, complex skills cannot be maintained. Expertise becomes rare. Mistakes accumulate. Over generations, techniques simplify. This explanation is plausible and grounded, but it also implies fragility. It suggests that human advancement is less resilient than often assumed, that entire ways of knowing can disappear quietly without catastrophe. If this is true, then the lost epoch is not a single event, but a process, a thinning of memory, a narrowing of possibility. Knowledge slipping away not through fire or flood, but through interruption, through lives cut short, through connections broken, through the slow erosion of shared context. What makes this unsettling is not the loss itself, but its invisibility. History prefers what can be named, dated, and categorized. It struggles with what leaves no marker. When continuity breaks, the narrative smooths over the gap. Labels appear: transition, dark age, prelude. These words cover uncertainty without resolving it. And yet, beneath them, the silence remains. It invites a different kind of listening. Not for answers, but for patterns. Not for certainty, but for humility. The past may not align with modern expectations of progress. It may be more fragile, more cyclical, more prone to forgetting than we prefer to believe. As the story continues, this silence will widen rather than close. Each layer peeled back reveals not clarity, but further absence. The question is not whether something was lost. The record suggests that it was. The deeper question is how often this has happened before, unnoticed, reshaping humanity each time. If knowledge can disappear without violence, without record, without acknowledgement, then what else might history have already forgotten? The silence from the previous layer does not resolve itself as the record continues. Instead, it deepens. When the material culture reappears after this gap, it does so in a quieter register, as though something once fluent is now being spoken hesitantly. Tools that had reached refined forms return simplified. Techniques that required long apprenticeship seem absent. What emerges feels functional, careful, but restrained, as if shaped by caution rather than confidence. In several regions, archaeologists have noted this regression with unease. Stone blades lose their symmetry. Composite tools disappear. Ornamentation becomes sparse. Symbolic markings that once suggested shared cosmologies thin out or vanish entirely. These are not isolated observations but repeated patterns, separated by geography, yet strangely aligned in character. The world after the gap appears less intricate, not because humans were less capable, but because something in the conditions of life had changed. Regression is an uncomfortable word in histories built on ascent. It implies that complexity is not guaranteed, that advancement can be reversed. Yet the evidence suggests that simplification was not accidental. It appears deliberate, adaptive. In environments under stress, excess becomes liability. Techniques that require specialized knowledge may be abandoned in favor of those that can be taught quickly, remembered easily, reproduced under pressure. What looks like loss may have been survival. Still, survival does not explain everything. Some abandoned techniques would have improved efficiency even in harsh conditions. Their disappearance suggests not only environmental constraint, but social rupture. Knowledge lives in people, not objects. When carriers of skill are lost, the skill itself can vanish within a generation. Apprenticeship requires time, stability, trust. In periods of disruption, those conditions erode first. There is also the question of scale. Many advanced techniques depend on networks. Trade routes, seasonal gatherings, shared rituals, these sustain complexity. When populations scatter or shrink, networks fray. Isolation favors self-sufficiency over specialization. Over time, this reshapes culture, not through collapse but through narrowing. Yet narrowing leaves traces. It leaves hints of what once existed. A partial technique here, an echo of symbolism there, like fragments of a language remembered imperfectly. These hints suggest that the simpler cultures were not beginnings, but adaptations built atop forgotten foundations. What troubles researchers is the apparent coordination of this forgetting. Across different regions, simplification occurs in similar windows of time, not identical, but resonant. This alignment invites speculation, though it resists easy explanation. Climate alone does not account for cultural synchronization, nor does migration, which tends to diversify rather than homogenize practices. One hypothesis proposes bottlenecks, periods when human populations fell drastically. Genetic studies do suggest moments of extreme reduction when the number of breeding individuals narrowed sharply. In such bottlenecks, diversity collapses. Not only genetic diversity, but cultural diversity as well. Skills, stories, rituals, all depend on redundancy. Without enough carriers, entire traditions can disappear. If this is the case, then the lost epoch may reflect not a failure of intelligence, but a vulnerability of transmission. Human knowledge, for all its adaptability, is fragile. It requires continuity. Break that continuity, and even the most sophisticated systems can unravel quietly. This reframes the archaeological silence. It becomes less an accusation of ignorance and more a record of fragility, a reminder that progress is not stored in stone, but in memory, and memory, when stretched too thin, breaks. There is another layer to consider. Simplification may also reflect restraint. After upheaval, societies may consciously avoid complexity. Elaborate systems carry risk. They bind people to assumptions that may no longer hold. Simpler tools and social structures allow flexibility. They permit rapid adjustment when conditions remain uncertain. In this light, regression becomes strategy rather than loss. But strategy does not erase the sense of interruption. The question lingers. What was set aside, and was it ever recovered? Some techniques reappear later, sometimes centuries or millennia after their first disappearance. When they do, they often seem rediscovered rather than inherited, reinvented rather than remembered. This suggests that the chain of transmission had been broken completely. Reinvention carries cost. It requires time, experimentation, failure. It implies that earlier solutions were not available to later generations. That knowledge, once lost, must be paid for again. This is perhaps the quietest tragedy of the lost epoch, not catastrophe, but redundancy. Humanity relearning what it once knew, unaware that it had known it before. Historians rarely dwell on this repetition. It complicates narratives of linear advancement. It suggests that civilization is less a steady climb than a series of rises and resets. Each reset leaves faint impressions of what came before, but not enough to prevent repetition. The emotional weight of this realization is subtle. It does not inspire fear so much as humility. If knowledge can vanish without record, then certainty becomes provisional. What we believe to be origins may be recoveries. What we call innovation may be remembrance without recognition. As this pattern emerges, the gap from the previous part no longer feels empty. It feels crowded with loss, with unrecorded decisions, with adaptations made under pressure, with choices that favored survival over continuity. The silence becomes active, shaped by necessity rather than neglect. Yet even this framing does not close the question, because some losses appear too selective, too precise. Certain forms vanish while others persist. Certain symbols are abandoned while others endure. The logic behind these choices remains obscure. This obscurity sets the stage for deeper inquiry. If collapse and adaptation do not fully account for the pattern, then other forces may have shaped what survived. Forces that favored certain memories over others. Forces that filtered knowledge not by usefulness alone, but by compatibility with new social orders. The next layer will turn toward those forces not as villains, but as structures. Structures that shape memory by shaping survival. And as the silence continues to echo, the question sharpens rather than fades. Who or what decides which knowledge is worth carrying forward when the world breaks? The question does not point immediately to intention. It drifts first toward structure. Because long before institutions learn to preserve knowledge, they learn to organize survival. And survival, when managed collectively, begins to shape memory in subtle ways. What is repeated becomes stable. What is not repeated becomes fragile. Over time, fragility looks like absence. After the earlier simplifications, new patterns begin to appear in the archaeological record. They are faint, but consistent. Settlements grow slightly more permanent. Seasonal movement narrows. Certain locations begin to draw repeated return. These are not yet cities, not yet agriculture, but they hint at something shifting beneath the surface. Human groups begin to anchor themselves more deliberately, even as the environment remains unstable. With anchoring comes selection. When people gather in one place more often, not all practices can follow. Some skills require movement. Some rituals depend on dispersed landscapes. Some knowledge only functions across wide territories. As mobility contracts, so does the range of lived experience. Memory compresses. This compression does not announce itself as loss. It feels like focus. A community that returns to the same valley year after year learns that valley deeply. Its soil, its water, its animals. Knowledge becomes local, efficient, intimate, but also narrower. What lies beyond the familiar begins to fade from relevance. This is how forgetting can feel like mastery. At the same time, permanence introduces hierarchy. Not immediately, not formally, but gradually. When groups remain together longer, differences accumulate. Age, skill, proximity to resources all begin to matter more consistently. Authority, once fluid and situational, starts to settle. Decisions that were once collective become habitual. Voices repeat more often than others. This matters because memory follows authority. Stories told by influential voices endure. Practices endorsed by respected figures persist. Over generations, this shapes what is taught and what is allowed to lapse. Knowledge is no longer only what works, but what fits within emerging social rhythms. Archaeological hints of this process appear in uneven distributions of material culture. Certain symbols become standardized. Certain tools dominate. Variations decline. This is often interpreted as cultural cohesion, but it may also reflect filtering. Diversity is costly to maintain. Uniformity simplifies transmission. Once simplification takes hold socially, it reinforces itself. Children learn fewer variants. Apprenticeship narrows. Experimentation declines. What survives is what aligns with the dominant pattern. What falls outside it becomes risky to practice, then unnecessary to remember. None of this requires deliberate suppression. It unfolds naturally when survival depends on coordination at scale. Complexity that cannot be shared easily becomes liability. Knowledge that cannot be standardized becomes unstable. Over time, entire traditions can disappear not because they failed, but because they did not scale. This reframes the lost epoch again. It may not mark a single collapse, but a threshold, a point at which human societies began to favor coherence over diversity, stability over exploration, memory over discovery. Yet coherence has a shadow. When memory becomes centralized, it becomes vulnerable to distortion. A story repeated by many voices resists change. A story repeated by few voices shapes belief. Over generations, the difference matters. Some researchers have noted that certain symbolic systems appear suddenly and spread rapidly, replacing older, more varied expressions. These systems often emphasize order, repetition, and hierarchy. They suggest not just shared meaning, but shared control over meaning. Interpretation narrows. Ambiguity declines. This may be the earliest trace of ideological memory. Memory shaped not only by environment, but by social necessity, by the need to coordinate larger groups, by the need to reduce friction, by the need to legitimize emerging authority. If so, then the lost epoch is not only about vanished techniques, but about vanished ways of knowing, ways that tolerated ambiguity, ways that thrived on plurality, ways that resisted fixation. Such ways leave little trace. They do not produce monuments. They do not demand standardization. They dissolve easily when conditions favor structure. Their disappearance is quiet, almost courteous. They step aside as order takes root. But quiet does not mean insignificant. These early ways may have carried insights poorly suited to permanence. Insights about impermanence itself, about adaptation without accumulation, about survival without dominance. When later systems look back, they may not recognize these insights as knowledge at all. They may see only absence, only simplicity, only lack. This misrecognition shapes historical narrative. What does not fit the logic of progress is minimized. What cannot be integrated into linear development is dismissed. Over time, this becomes habit. The past is filtered through the needs of the present. Here the question of control becomes unavoidable. Not control by shadowy forces, but by frameworks, by the assumptions that determine what counts as advancement, what counts as intelligence, what counts as worth remembering. Academic disciplines, for all their rigor, inherit these assumptions. They search for continuity where continuity flatters progress. They frame gaps as ignorance rather than choice. They rarely ask whether certain knowledge was incompatible with the directions civilization chose. Yet incompatibility leaves fingerprints. In myths that contradict dominant cosmologies, in rituals that persist without explanation, in practices labeled primitive despite their endurance. These fragments suggest that something else once existed alongside the ancestors of civilization, then slipped out of alignment. The lost epoch may therefore represent a divergence rather than a disappearance, a moment when multiple paths were available and only some were taken. The others did not fail. They were simply not chosen by the structures that followed. As this becomes clearer, the silence begins to feel less like an erasure and more like a refusal to translate. Certain ways of being do not survive abstraction. They cannot be archived. They can only be lived. Once living conditions change, they fade. Not violently, but thoroughly. This brings an unsettling calm, because it implies that the greatest losses in human history may not be catastrophic events, but gentle transitions, shifts so gradual that no one notices what is left behind until it is no longer recoverable. And if that is true, then the next layer of inquiry cannot focus only on what vanished, but on what replaced it, on the systems that proved durable enough to endure, even as they narrowed possibility, on the trade-offs embedded so deeply that they now feel inevitable. The silence invites one more question before moving forward. If early human knowledge was filtered not by truth alone, but by compatibility with emerging order, how much of what we now call history is shaped less by what happened and more by what could be carried forward without breaking the system that followed? The system that followed did not announce itself with names or banners. It took shape through habit, through repetition, through small decisions made in the name of continuity. And once continuity becomes the goal, memory begins to serve it differently. In earlier human worlds, memory moved with people. It lived in bodies, in paths walked repeatedly, in seasonal returns that carried stories forward without fixing them in place. But as communities anchored themselves more firmly, memory began to settle as well. It attached itself to locations, to objects, to sequences that could be repeated without change. This shift seems subtle in the record, a ritual site reused without alteration, a symbol carved the same way, generation after generation. a tool design preserved even when alternatives were possible. These are often described as signs of tradition, but tradition, when stabilized, also limits motion. Because when memory becomes tied to fixed forms, it resists reinterpretation. The story must be told the same way. The mark must be made in the same place. Deviation begins to feel like risk, not exploration. Over time, memory hardens into instruction. This is not yet writing, but it is preparation for it. At this stage, something curious appears across distant regions. Similar symbolic structures emerge in environments that share little else. Repeated motifs, ordered sequences, hierarchical arrangements. They suggest a common pressure rather than common origin, a need to organize meaning so that it can be transmitted reliably within larger, denser groups. Reliability becomes more important than richness. In this environment, ambiguity becomes inconvenient. Multiple interpretations slow coordination. Symbolic flexibility, once useful in small groups, becomes noise. What survives are meanings that can be taught quickly, remembered easily, and enforced collectively. This has consequences for what is allowed to fade. Knowledge that depends on personal experience loses standing. Knowledge that cannot be demonstrated publicly becomes suspect. Practices rooted in intuition, sensation, or solitary insight struggle to justify themselves. They are not easily shared. They cannot be standardized. They resist oversight. Over generations, these practices retreat, not because they are forbidden, but because they no longer fit the emerging logic of communal survival. Their absence leaves no obvious gap. Life continues. Order strengthens. Memory feels secure. Only later does the cost become visible. Some anthropologists have noted that early symbolic systems often emphasize cycles, balance, and reciprocity, while later ones increasingly emphasize lineage, authority, and permanence. This suggests a shift in how humans related to time itself, from recurrence to progression, from return to accumulation. Progression requires markers. It requires beginnings and endings. It requires a narrative that moves forward rather than around, and narratives that move forward must simplify the past to make space for the future. This is where epochs begin to form. An epoch is not merely a period of time. It is a story about time, a way of grouping experience so that change appears coherent. But coherence demands omission. Continuity is constructed by selecting what counts as foundational and discarding what does not align. The lost epoch may be the residue of this process, a stretch of human experience that does not support the story of linear advancement, a layer too fluid, too diverse, too resistant to categorization. Rather than being erased, it is folded, compressed, treated as background. This folding happens quietly. Early chronicles do not lie outright. They simply begin their accounts later. They frame origins at moments of clarity, the first city, the first king, the first law. Everything before becomes prelude, necessary but indistinct. This indistinction is often justified as lack of evidence, but evidence exists. It simply does not speak the language later systems expect. It does not offer dates. It does not align with political boundaries. It does not distinguish clearly between myth and practice, so it is set aside. Even today, when new findings challenge established timelines, they are often absorbed cautiously, not rejected outright, but contextualized in ways that minimize disruption. A site is older than expected but isolated. A technology appears earlier, but accidental. An alignment suggests advanced knowledge, but coincidental. This is not conspiracy, it is inertia. Frameworks once established resist revision. They are not defended aggressively. They are simply assumed. To question them requires effort disproportionate to the apparent reward. It introduces uncertainty where stability has been achieved. Yet uncertainty is where the lost epoch seems to live, in moments where data does not fit, in transitions that feel too abrupt, in silences that stretch longer than expected. These are not failures of record-keeping. They are signals of compression. Compression hides complexity. It makes history manageable. But it also distorts proportion. Thousands of years can vanish into a paragraph. Entire lifeways can be summarized as primitive stages. What remains is not false, but incomplete. This incompleteness becomes visible when the same questions recur across cultures. Why do flood myths appear everywhere? Why do origin stories speak of forgotten ages? Why do early traditions describe cycles of destruction and renewal rather than steady ascent? These stories may not be literal records, but they may preserve something more elusive, a memory of discontinuity, a sense that what exists now is not the first arrangement nor the most comprehensive. Such memories are difficult to verify, and so they are often dismissed. But dismissal itself is a choice, a way of protecting narrative clarity. The Lost Epoch, then, may not be a single missing chapter, but a missing way of reading, a mode of understanding time that does not privilege accumulation, a perspective that sees loss as transformation rather than failure. If such a perspective once guided human societies, its disappearance would leave a subtle imbalance, one that favors growth without reflection, expansion without return. As this imbalance grows, it becomes easier to imagine that the past was simpler than the present. That complexity increases naturally over time. That knowledge accumulates without cost. But the archaeological and anthropological records suggest otherwise. They hint at peaks and contractions, at skills mastered and then abandoned, at understandings that flourished briefly and then faded. These patterns challenge the comfort of linear progress. They suggest that human history may be shaped less like a ladder and more like a tide, advancing, retreating, reshaping the shoreline with each cycle. If this is so, then the lost epoch may not be behind us at all. It may exist wherever memory contracts too tightly around a single narrative, wherever diversity of thought gives way to efficiency, wherever coherence is valued over resilience. This raises a final thought to carry forward. If forgetting is not always accidental, and if memory often serves structure more than truth, then the question is not simply what was lost, but what continues to be filtered out today. And if future generations look back on this moment, will they see a seamless story of advancement, or will they sense another quiet compression, another thinning of possibility, another epoch folded gently into silence? There are moments in the record where time seems to hesitate, not stop, not reverse, but pause long enough for something to shift beneath the surface. These moments do not announce catastrophe, they arrive quietly, disguised as continuity, even as they rearrange the foundations of memory. One such hesitation appears in the transition from oral worlds to recorded ones. Long before writing becomes common, there is a period in which speech begins to behave differently. Words carry more weight, names persist longer than bodies, lineage starts to matter in ways it did not before. In small, mobile societies, a name fades when the person does. Reputation survives only as long as it is useful. But as populations thicken and movement slows, names detach from presence. They begin to stand in for authority. To speak a name is to invoke something beyond the immediate moment. This is where power begins to lean on memory. Not memory as lived experience, but memory as reference, as proof, as justification. The earliest lists are not stories. They are sequences. Kings, ancestors, offerings. They do not explain, they assert. Their purpose is not to remember everything, but to establish order, to say, this came before that. This belongs above that. What is left out becomes increasingly important. Archaeologists sometimes note that early records appear suddenly sophisticated, with little visible experimentation. Scripts emerge already structured, calendars already aligned, social roles already defined. The gradual steps that should precede such systems are difficult to trace. This gap is often explained as loss of material, perishable media, fragile tools. And that explanation is reasonable. But it also obscures another possibility, that these systems were not built slowly in public view, but consolidated rapidly from existing informal knowledge. If so, much of what came before would not look like preparation. It would look like absence. Consider navigation, agriculture, astronomy. These require long observation, yet their formal expressions appear abruptly. This suggests that knowledge may have existed in distributed forms long before it was centralized and recorded. Centralization changes knowledge. Once gathered, it must be simplified. Conflicting interpretations are resolved. Local variations are flattened. What remains is portable, teachable, enforceable, but it is also narrower. This narrowing may explain why certain sophisticated understandings seem to appear without precedent, while others vanish entirely. They were not invented suddenly. They were selected. Selection favors what supports structure. Over time, this process creates a feedback loop. Records reinforce authority. Authority controls records. Memory becomes curated, not necessarily manipulated, but guided. And guidance shapes silence. Entire modes of knowing, those rooted in sensation, ritual, or environment, become difficult to express in centralized forms. They resist codification. They cannot be easily archived. As a result, they slip into the margins. Later generations, encountering these margins, interpret them as superstition or myth. The original context is gone. What remains feels irrational. This reinterpretation distances modern observers from earlier minds. It creates the illusion that people once thought differently in kind, not in context, that they were less capable, less precise, less aware. But evidence suggests otherwise. Tool-making requires foresight. Ritual requires pattern recognition. Environmental attunement requires sustained attention. These are not primitive skills. They are demanding ones. They simply do not align with later definitions of intelligence. The Lost Epoch may be the period during which these definitions changed. As societies grew more complex, intelligence became associated with abstraction, with detachment, with the ability to manipulate symbols independently of immediate experience. This shift favored certain minds, certain roles, certain institutions. Those who thrived under the old model did not disappear, but their skills lost prominence. They became less visible, less valued, less recorded. What survives in the archive reflects this bias. Even today, When researchers encounter anomalous artifacts, objects that suggest advanced craftsmanship or unexpected knowledge, they often struggle to place them. They do not fit the sequence. They threaten coherence, so they are labeled outliers. Outliers accumulate quietly. At some point, their number becomes uncomfortable, not enough to overturn the narrative, but enough to strain it. Each one asks the same question: what if the sequence is incomplete? The idea of a lost epoch does not require a vanished civilization with machines and monuments. It requires only that certain forms of understanding flourished briefly, then faded without leaving durable traces. This kind of loss is difficult to detect because it leaves no ruins. It leaves habits, sensibilities, myths, intuitions. These traces surface unexpectedly, in recurring symbols, in cross-cultural similarities that lack clear transmission paths, in shared anxieties about decline and renewal. They also surface in discomfort with linear history itself, a sense that something does not add up, that the past feels thinner than it should. This feeling is often dismissed as romanticism, a longing for mystery in a world that prefers certainty. But longing can also be diagnostic. It can point toward absence. Absence, when persistent, demands explanation. Perhaps the lost epoch is not a failure of preservation, but a feature of human adaptation. Perhaps societies shed certain ways of knowing when they become incompatible with new structures. Perhaps forgetting is not always imposed, but chosen. If so, then the question shifts. Not what was erased, but why it was let go. Was it too slow for expanding systems? Too local? Too resistant to hierarchy? Did it privilege balance over growth, presence over accumulation? These traits may have served humanity well for long stretches of time, but they may have become liabilities under different conditions. The cost of abandoning them would not be immediate. It would unfold gradually, in new forms of stress, in disconnection from environment, in reliance on external systems to regulate behavior. These costs may not appear in the historical record. They appear in bodies, in patterns of illness, in cycles of collapse. When civilizations fall, their explanations often focus on external shocks: invasion, climate, mismanagement. But beneath these lie deeper vulnerabilities, ways of living that no longer adapt. If earlier societies maintained resilience through distributed knowledge and local responsiveness, then centralization may have traded flexibility for control. The lost epoch may mark the last time flexibility dominated. As we move forward in this exploration, another question emerges, quietly but persistently. If human history includes periods of profound adaptation that left few traces, how many times has this happened? And if forgetting is built into progress, what is being forgotten now, so smoothly, so thoroughly, that future generations will struggle to imagine it ever existed? If forgetting can be chosen, it rarely announces itself as such. It arrives as convenience, as efficiency, as relief. The burden of remembering everything is heavy, and human societies have always learned how to set weight down quietly. There are moments when this shedding becomes visible, when a technology simplifies life but also narrows perception, when a new order promises stability at the cost of older freedoms, when complexity is traded for predictability. These moments are rarely framed as losses. They are celebrated as advances. Yet the archaeological record carries hints of something else, not collapse, but smoothing. Rough edges disappear. Diversity of form gives way to standard shapes. Local variation thins. Tools become uniform. Settlements align. Ritual spaces repeat patterns across regions. Uniformity is useful. It allows scale. It allows coordination among strangers. But it also compresses possibility. In earlier periods, difference was tolerated because it could not be controlled. Communities adapted to their immediate surroundings. Knowledge grew sideways rather than upward. No single model dominated for long. This produced redundancy. Multiple ways to solve the same problem. Multiple ways to interpret the same signal. Redundancy is inefficient but resilient. When systems centralize, redundancy becomes waste. One solution is selected. Others are abandoned. Over time, this selection reshapes memory. What was once common becomes rare. What was rare becomes invisible. The Lost Epoch may coincide with this transition. Evidence for such a shift appears subtly. In mythologies that speak of earlier ages, golden ages, ages of heroes, times when humans lived closer to gods or nature, these stories appear across cultures, separated by geography and language. They differ in detail but share a tone of distance and regret. They are often dismissed as metaphor, as moral allegory. But myths also preserve memory in distorted form. They encode experiences that resist straightforward transmission. What if these myths are not memories of utopia, but of difference, of a way of living that felt coherent, even if difficult? A time before systems hardened. Myth compresses time. It collapses generations into symbols. It does not care for chronology. This makes it unreliable as history, but valuable as signal. When many cultures signal the same loss, something demands attention. Another signal appears in early philosophical traditions. Thinkers who warn against excess, against abstraction divorced from experience, against forgetting the limits of the body and the land. These warnings emerge early, suggesting the tension was already felt. They are often read as reactions to decadence, but decadence presumes abundance. What if they were reactions to disorientation? As systems grow, individuals lose sight of how their actions connect to outcomes. Responsibility diffuses. Feedback delays. The sense of agency thins. This produces anxiety not easily named. Earlier ways of knowing may have anchored agency differently, through direct interaction, through visible consequence, through shared responsibility within small groups. When these anchors loosen, something must replace them. Law, doctrine, measurement. These substitutes stabilize behavior, but they also externalize control. Control feels safer than uncertainty. In choosing safety, societies may have let go of skills that thrived in uncertainty. Skills like deep attention, improvisation, sensitivity to subtle environmental cues. These do not scale well. They resist formalization. As a result, they fade from prominence. This fading would not be total. It would leave traces in crafts that survive without clear lineage, in practices that feel older than their explanations, in moments of resonance with nature that feel oddly familiar. Modern science occasionally stumbles upon these traces. Discoveries that suggest ancient peoples understood phenomena, thought to be recent, knowledge of plant properties, acoustic design, astronomical alignment. These findings provoke surprise, then normalization. Explanations are found to fit them into accepted frameworks. But fitting is not the same as understanding. Understanding requires context, and context is what is missing. The Lost Epoch may be less about what was known and more about how knowledge was held, not as information, but as relationship, not stored, but practiced, not abstracted, but lived. Such knowledge would leave minimal trace. It would not accumulate. It would dissipate with each generation unless continuously renewed. This makes it fragile. When conditions change rapidly, climate shifts, population growth, migration, fragile systems struggle. They must adapt or dissolve. Some elements adapt, others are discarded. The discarding may have been necessary, but necessity does not erase consequence. As newer systems stabilized, they produced histories that reflected their own values. They favored permanence, hierarchy, record. They privileged what could be written, counted, owned. What could not be captured this way was excluded. Exclusion shapes identity. Over time, humanity began to see itself as a builder of structures rather than a participant in cycles, as a manager of resources rather than a responder to signals, as separate from environment rather than embedded within it. This shift is foundational. It underlies later developments in philosophy, religion, economics. It frames the modern world. But foundations also obscure what lies beneath. Occasionally, crises crack the surface. Environmental limits assert themselves. Systems strain. Individuals feel disconnected from meaning. In these moments, older sensibilities resurface. Calls for simplicity, for return to nature, for community. These calls are often impractical, romantic, but their recurrence suggests unresolved tension. Perhaps the lost epoch is not a single time, but a recurring pattern, a cycle of adaptation and forgetting. Each time humanity grows beyond certain thresholds, it sheds ways of knowing that no longer fit. Each time, it pays a price later. If so, then history is not linear but oscillatory, progress and loss intertwined. This perspective does not deny advancement. It complicates it. It asks whether growth can occur without amnesia, whether complexity can coexist with intimacy, whether scale can preserve sensitivity. The archive cannot answer these questions. It is built from what survived selection. To glimpse what was lost, we must attend to absences, to discomforts, to persistent myths. We must also attend to ourselves. The unease many feel in modern life may not be purely psychological. It may be historical, a mismatch between inherited capacities and current conditions. If earlier humans navigated uncertainty with tools we no longer cultivate, then our discomfort may be diagnostic, a signal pointing backward as much as forward. The lost epoch, then, is not sealed in the past. It reverberates. As we continue, another layer of silence comes into focus. Not the silence of vanished knowledge, but of those who noticed its disappearance at the time. Who were the witnesses to forgetting? And why did their voices not endure? Those who notice a loss while it is happening rarely sound like prophets. They sound hesitant, unsure. Their words lack the clarity that hindsight provides, and so they are easy to overlook. If the lost epoch involved a gradual narrowing of how humans related to the world, then some must have felt that narrowing from the inside. Not as catastrophe, but as a subtle shift, a sense that something once obvious had become harder to access, that life required more explanation than it used to. Such feelings rarely survive in records. They do not translate well into law or myth. They live in tone, in complaint, in quiet resistance. They pass between people rather than through institutions. Yet faint traces remain. In early texts from emerging civilizations, there are moments of unease, passages that question the value of growth, that warn of forgetting older ways, that describe ancestors as wiser, closer to truth, more attuned to natural order. These are not dominant themes, but they recur. They appear in laments about cities growing too large, in warnings that writing weakens memory, in concerns that specialization fragments understanding. These observations arise early, suggesting the shift they respond to was already underway. They are often framed as moral decline. But morality is a convenient language for expressing disorientation. When systems change faster than intuition can adapt, discomfort seeks explanation. The witnesses to forgetting may not have understood what was being lost. They could sense the effect without naming the cause. This made their testimony fragile, easy to reinterpret, easy to dismiss. Those who benefited from new systems had little incentive to amplify such voices. Stability favors silence about its costs. As societies formalized knowledge, authority shifted. Knowing became less about participation and more about position. Priests, scribes, officials, roles emerged that managed meaning on behalf of others. This was efficient. It reduced uncertainty, but it also created distance. Distance changes trust. When meaning is mediated, individuals rely on interpreters. Over time, this reliance becomes expectation. The ability to orient oneself diminishes, replaced by compliance. In this environment, those who sensed loss may have been labeled nostalgic, impractical, even dangerous. Not because they threatened power directly, but because they challenged assumptions. Challenges to assumptions are unsettling. The archive, shaped by institutions, preserves what aligns with structure. What resists structure survives only by accident. A marginal note, a story retold orally long after its context faded, a practice that persists without explanation. These survivals are often misread. They appear irrational, superstitious. But irrationality can be a sign of decontextualized knowledge, practices stripped of the frameworks that once made them coherent. Consider rituals that continue long after their original purpose is forgotten, or taboos whose rationale no one recalls yet which still feel necessary. These are not meaningless. They are fragments. Fragments do not explain themselves. They provoke curiosity or dismissal. Modern scholarship tends toward dismissal unless explanation can be reconstructed. This is reasonable. But it may also replicate the original forgetting. By privileging what can be explained, it marginalizes what cannot. The lost epoch may be populated not by grand secrets, but by ordinary sensibilities that became incompatible with later systems. Ways of noticing, ways of deciding, ways of belonging. These do not leave monuments. They leave discomfort when absent. As systems scaled, humans learned to operate through abstraction. Numbers replaced relationships, maps replaced journeys, rules replaced negotiation. Each substitution solved a problem. Each introduced a gap. Abstraction allows coordination across distance and time. It is powerful, but it also thins experience. It reduces the richness of context to manageable symbols. Those who grew up before such substitutions may have felt the thinning acutely. Those born into it would not notice. This generational effect matters. Forgetting does not require suppression. It requires time. Within a few generations, what was once intuitive becomes obscure. What was once practiced becomes mythologized. What was once lived becomes theorized. The witnesses to forgetting may have existed primarily at this boundary between lived and abstracted worlds. Their insights would have been partial, their language inadequate, their authority weak. It is not surprising that they faded. What remains are echoes. Echoes in the recurring human desire to return to simplicity even amid abundance, in the appeal of practices that bypass explanation and emphasize presence, in the sense that modern life is somehow over-mediated. These echoes do not point to a specific past to recover. They point to a relationship that has shifted. The lost epoch, then, is not just a gap in chronology, it is a gap in orientation. Orientation answers a simple question: how do you know where you are? Earlier humans may have answered this through direct engagement, through feedback from environment and community, through cycles that reinforced belonging. As systems grew, orientation increasingly came from external references. Calendars, texts, authorities. These are useful, but they do not respond. When external references fail or conflict, disorientation deepens, anxiety rises, meaning feels unstable. In such moments, societies often double down on structure, more rules, more measurement, more control. This can stabilize behavior, but it does not restore orientation. It manages symptoms. The witnesses to forgetting may have sensed this distinction. They may have known that what was being lost could not be replaced by structure alone. But without language to articulate this, their knowledge remained tacit. And tacit knowledge is vulnerable. Tacit knowledge depends on continuity, on mentorship, on shared practice. When societies fragment or centralize rapidly, these channels break. The lost epoch may correspond to such a break, a point where continuity snapped under pressure and tacit knowledge dissipated faster than it could be transmitted. If so, then the silence that follows is not mysterious. It is structural. The question becomes not what was hidden, but what could not survive the transition. As we move deeper, another possibility emerges, that forgetting was not only accidental or necessary, but sometimes encouraged. That certain ways of knowing threatened emerging orders simply by existing, not because they opposed authority overtly, but because they made authority less necessary. This possibility invites caution rather than accusation. Systems protect themselves instinctively. They privilege what sustains them. If earlier modes of orientation reduced dependence on centralized meaning, their marginalization would have been almost automatic. No conspiracy required, only alignment of incentives. In this light, the lost epoch is not an anomaly. It is a recurring outcome of scale. As humanity continues to scale its systems, the question persists quietly beneath the noise. Not whether something was lost long ago, but whether something is being lost now. And if so, who is noticing it as it happens, and how long before their voices too fade into silence? When forgetting becomes structural, it no longer feels like forgetting at all. It feels like normality. The absence settles in so thoroughly that its shape is no longer noticed. Only its effects remain. One of those effects is a quiet impatience with ambiguity. Earlier ways of knowing tolerated uncertainty because they were embedded in ongoing relationship. You learned by staying close, by watching patterns repeat, by adjusting slowly. Ambiguity was not a problem to solve, but a condition to live with. As systems grew, ambiguity became costly. Large populations require predictability. Predictability demands clarity. Clarity demands simplification. This is where gaps begin to form. Simplification does not erase complexity. It hides it. It compresses nuance into categories. It favors what can be standardized and measured. What resists measurement becomes peripheral. Over time, this creates a selective blindness. Certain questions stop being asked not because they are forbidden, but because they do not fit prevailing frameworks. Curiosity narrows to what can be answered efficiently. The Lost Epoch may correspond to such a narrowing, a period when questions once considered natural gradually became impractical, when inquiry shifted from "how do we live well within this world" to "how do we organize this world more effectively?" These are not opposing aims, but they pull attention in different directions. Evidence of this shift appears in early administrative records. Lists replace stories, counts replace descriptions. Land becomes parcels, people become units. This does not dehumanize by intent, it abstracts by necessity. Abstraction allows coordination across distance. It also flattens difference. As abstraction spreads, memory externalizes. What was once remembered through repetition is now recorded. This frees cognitive space. It also weakens embodied recall. Skills atrophy when no longer practiced. The earlier world likely relied heavily on embodied knowledge, skills learned through doing, sensing, adjusting. These skills do not translate well into record. They require presence. When record becomes primary, presence becomes optional. This transition has consequences that ripple outward. Education shifts from apprenticeship to instruction. Authority shifts from experience to credential. Trust shifts from familiarity to verification. Each shift solves a problem. Each introduces a new fragility. Fragility appears when systems encounter conditions they were not designed for. Rapid environmental change, social disruption, loss of infrastructure. In such moments, abstract knowledge struggles to reground itself. Earlier embodied knowledge may have been better suited to such conditions, but if it has faded, adaptation slows. The lost epoch may be visible in these moments of lag, when societies struggle to respond to change despite abundant information, when data accumulates faster than understanding, when expertise proliferates but confidence erodes. This paradox is modern, but its roots may be ancient. As humans move toward greater control over environment, they traded responsiveness for stability. Stability reduced immediate risk. It also reduced sensitivity to early warning signals. Early warning signals are often subtle. Changes in animal behavior, shifts in plant health, alterations in soundscape. These signals require attention attuned to variability. Centralized systems favor thresholds. Limits are defined numerically. Responses are triggered after thresholds are crossed. This is efficient but reactive. Earlier systems may have been more anticipatory, less precise but more sensitive. Sensitivity is difficult to maintain at scale. The witnesses to forgetting may have noticed this loss of sensitivity. They may have observed that people no longer noticed what once mattered. That life felt safer but duller, more ordered but less alive. Such observations do not translate easily into reform. They resist codification. They sound subjective. Subjectivity is mistrusted in systems that value uniformity. As a result, these perceptions would have remained marginal, shared privately, passed quietly, or not passed at all. Over time, the gap widens between what systems reward and what humans feel. Discomfort grows. Meaning feels manufactured. Orientation weakens. To compensate, societies generate narratives that reaffirm purpose. Ideologies, myths of progress, promises of future fulfillment. These narratives soothe anxiety. They also defer reckoning. The lost epoch becomes buried beneath layers of justification. But buried does not mean gone. Traces persist in cultural practices that emphasize slowness, presence, and locality, in traditions that resist acceleration, in values that prioritize sufficiency over accumulation. These practices are often marginalized as inefficient. They do not scale, but their persistence suggests they meet needs unmet elsewhere. Modern interest in mindfulness, for example, can be read as an attempt to recover attentional skills once embedded in daily life, not as spiritual luxury but as functional necessity. Similarly, the appeal of craft, of manual engagement, of direct interaction with materials may reflect a longing for feedback loops lost to automation. These trends are often commodified, their deeper significance diluted, but their recurrence is telling. The lost epoch may not have been lost all at once. It may have been eroded incrementally, each step justified, each loss rationalized. This makes it difficult to locate historically. There is no clear boundary, no single cause, only a gradient. Gradients are hard to narrate. History prefers events, revolutions, collapses, discoveries. But the most profound transformations often occur without spectacle. They seep. Seeping transformations leave behind contradictions, advanced systems that feel unsatisfying, abundant societies that feel insecure, knowledge-rich cultures that feel disoriented. These contradictions invite explanation. They are often addressed through more system building, more optimization, more control. But if the root issue is relational rather than technical, such solutions may deepen the gap. The lost epoch, understood this way, is not a golden age to reclaim. It is a mode of alignment to understand, alignment between perception and environment, between action and consequence, between individual and community. Alignment does not guarantee comfort, it guarantees coherence. Coherence may be what is missing. As humanity continues to face challenges that strain global systems, climate instability, resource limits, social fragmentation, the question of coherence becomes urgent, not because earlier humans had answers, but because they lived within constraints that enforced coherence naturally. Modern societies must now recreate coherence consciously, without the scaffolding that once provided it. This is difficult. It requires restraint without scarcity, attention without necessity, community without proximity. Whether this is possible remains uncertain. The lost epoch does not tell us how to succeed. It tells us what was different. And difference, when examined carefully, can illuminate options otherwise unseen. As we move forward, the silence of that epoch invites not nostalgia, but listening. Listening for what our own time may be forgetting, even as it celebrates its advances. If forgetting once happened quietly, it may be happening again. And if so, the most important witnesses may not be those with the loudest voices, but those who feel the thinning before it can be named. The question lingers gently. What forms of knowledge are becoming inconvenient now, and what future silences will mark their passing? When knowledge becomes inconvenient, it rarely disappears through force. It fades through neglect. It becomes optional, then eccentric, then obsolete. Eventually, it is remembered only as curiosity, detached from function. The lost epoch may have unfolded through this pattern, not erased but outpaced. As societies increased their capacity to store information outside the body, memory shifted location. Clay tablets, knotted cords, carved marks, written symbols, all of these relieved the individual of a certain burden. You no longer needed to remember everything. The system would remember for you. This seemed like freedom, but memory is not neutral. What is remembered shapes what is valued. When memory externalizes, selection changes. What can be recorded easily survives. What resists recording weakens. Earlier ways of knowing often relied on timing, intuition, and context. These qualities are difficult to encode. They do not travel well across distance or time. They depend on presence. As presence became less necessary, such knowledge lost status. Over generations, children learned differently. Instead of absorbing patterns through long exposure, they learned instructions. Instead of developing sensitivity through immersion, they acquired rules. This made learning faster, more transferable. It also made it shallower. Shallow knowledge is not inferior by default. It is efficient. It allows specialization. It supports complex systems, but it requires supplementation. When rules fail, deeper understanding is needed to adapt. If deeper understanding has faded, adaptation falters. The lost epoch may correspond to a time when this balance tipped, when systems optimized for efficiency began to crowd out systems optimized for resilience, when speed overtook depth. Speed feels like progress, depth feels like delay. In early urban environments, speed was necessary. Trade networks expanded, populations grew, coordination across strangers required standardization. Time itself became regulated. Calendars fixed seasons, clocks fixed hours, schedules replaced rhythms. These tools were transformative. They enabled feats impossible before, but they also altered perception. Time became something to manage rather than inhabit. Earlier humans likely experienced time as texture, as variation within repetition. Modern humans experience time as scarcity. Scarcity produces urgency. Urgency narrows attention. Narrowed attention prioritizes immediate tasks over long-term orientation. This creates feedback loops. Systems built under urgency optimize for throughput, not meaning. Over time, this erodes coherence. The lost epoch may be the last period when coherence was default rather than goal. In that world, knowledge was inseparable from survival. You knew because knowing mattered. You attended because attention kept you alive. You adjusted because rigidity was punished by environment. In modern systems, survival is buffered. Feedback is delayed. Adjustment becomes optional. Optional behaviors atrophy. This does not mean modern humans are less capable. It means capabilities are redistributed. Certain skills intensify. Others fade. Navigation offers a clear example. Once essential, now outsourced. As tools improved, internal maps weakened. The skill was no longer required. Similarly, memory for oral tradition weakened as writing spread. Calculation skills shifted with devices. Pattern recognition shifted with algorithms. Each shift is rational. Each carries cost. The lost epoch may be defined by the cumulative cost of such shifts, long before they were recognized. Recognition requires contrast. Without living memory of earlier modes, loss remains invisible. This invisibility is not accidental. Systems stabilize themselves by normalizing their own conditions. What lies outside becomes unthinkable. Those who sense mismatch are often pathologized. Their discomfort framed as personal rather than structural. This misattribution deepens forgetting. In historical transitions, such misattributions recur. Early critics of writing worried about memory loss. Early critics of cities worried about alienation. Early critics of mechanization worried about meaning. They were not wrong. They were incomplete. Their critiques lacked scale. They could not foresee how deeply systems would reshape perception. The lost epoch may include many such incomplete critiques, warnings that pointed toward something real but lacked language to sustain themselves. Language matters. Without shared vocabulary, insight cannot organize. The absence of language for certain experiences accelerates their disappearance. Modern psychology has begun to rediscover some of these lost dimensions. Concepts like embodied cognition, ecological awareness, and situational intelligence echo older understandings. They suggest that cognition is not confined to the brain, that perception and action are intertwined, that environment participates in thinking. These ideas feel novel. They are not. They are rediscoveries framed in modern terms. This framing is necessary to legitimize them within current systems, but it also distances them from their original context. The Lost Epoch did not articulate these ideas theoretically. It lived them. Living leaves fewer traces than theorizing. As a result, modern attempts to recover such modes often feel artificial. Practices are isolated, scheduled, optimized. They become techniques rather than ways of life. This may be unavoidable. The conditions that supported earlier coherence no longer exist at scale, but understanding the loss may still matter. Understanding allows choice. Without understanding, adaptation is blind. The Lost Epoch invites a reframing of history not as a steady ascent, but as a series of trade-offs. Gains in one domain accompanied by losses in another. Such framing does not undermine progress. It humanizes it. Humanizing progress means acknowledging limits, acknowledging that not everything valuable can be scaled, stored, or automated. Some forms of knowledge require slowness. Others require proximity. Others require risk. Risk has become something to minimize at all costs. Yet earlier humans accepted risk as context, not anomaly. This acceptance shaped courage differently, not as heroism, but as steadiness. Steadiness is difficult to cultivate in accelerated systems. The Lost Epoch may have been steady, not calm, not safe, but steady in its demands. As systems accelerate, steadiness becomes rare. Attention fragments. Identity multiplies. Orientation weakens. This creates hunger for grounding. Grounding is sought in many ways, through nature, through ritual, through narrative, through sensation. These pursuits are often dismissed as escapism, but they may be compensatory. Compensation signals imbalance. The Lost Epoch, then, is not a secret chapter hidden by elites. It is a pattern of imbalance that repeats when systems outrun perception. Its study is not about uncovering hidden artifacts, but about recognizing recurrent symptoms. As we approach the final layers, the focus shifts again, from what was lost to why its absence continues to matter. Because forgetting is not finished, it is ongoing, and the most important gaps may not lie behind us but beneath our feet, quiet, structural, and still expanding. When absence persists long enough, it begins to shape behavior as if it were a presence. People respond not only to what exists, but to what no longer does. The Lost Epoch, though silent, exerts this kind of influence. It bends choices, values, and fears without being named. One way this influence appears is through acceleration. When orientation weakens, speed becomes substitute. Moving faster gives the illusion of direction. Producing more gives the illusion of security. Innovation promises resolution even when problems remain undefined. Acceleration masks uncertainty. Earlier, human systems did not move quickly because they did not need to. Feedback was immediate. Consequences followed closely. There was little advantage in outrunning awareness. Speed without understanding was dangerous. Modern systems invert this logic. They reward speed even when understanding lags. They assume correction can come later, that mistakes can be patched, that consequences can be deferred. This assumption holds until it doesn't. The Lost Epoch may have been the last long period when correction preceded escalation, when change was slow enough to be felt, discussed, adjusted to within a single generation, when memory and experience overlapped sufficiently to guide adaptation. As change accelerated, this overlap thinned. Memory fell behind reality. Experience lost predictive power. Orientation fractured. In response, societies leaned harder on abstraction. Models replaced intuition. Projections replaced observation. Risk was quantified. Futures simulated. These tools are powerful. They extend perception beyond immediate limits, but they also introduce distance. They translate lived complexity into manageable symbols. Symbols require interpretation. Interpretation concentrates authority. As authority concentrates, participation declines. People become operators within systems rather than co-creators of them. Their role narrows, their sense of agency shifts. Agency becomes indirect. Indirect agency is psychologically costly. When actions do not visibly matter, motivation decays. Responsibility diffuses. Meaning feels abstract. Earlier human systems anchored agency through visibility. You saw the effects of your actions. You felt their impact on others. This reinforced accountability without formal enforcement. The Lost Epoch may have been rich in this kind of visibility. Its absence leaves a vacuum often filled by surveillance, metrics, and incentives. These simulate feedback, but they are not the same. They measure outcomes rather than relationships. Relationships are harder to quantify. They resist optimization. When systems optimize away relationship, they also optimize away certain forms of care. Care that emerges spontaneously from proximity, from familiarity, from shared vulnerability. This does not mean modern humans care less. It means care is mediated, routed through institutions, professionalized. Professionalization ensures reliability. It also reduces personal engagement. The Lost Epoch may have relied on care that was not optional, not outsourced. Care as condition of survival. Such care fosters resilience differently. It binds individuals tightly. It creates mutual dependence. It limits scale. Scale and care are often in tension. As societies scaled, they prioritized mechanisms that allowed care to be delivered impersonally. This increased reach. It also changed the texture of care. Texture matters. The texture of life in earlier systems may have been rougher but more coherent. Pain and pleasure closely linked to action. Loss and gain shared visibly. This coherence grounded meaning. Modern life smooths texture. It buffers extremes. This increases comfort. It also reduces contrast. Reduced contrast dulls perception. Dulled perception increases risk of overshoot. Systems drift beyond sustainable limits before discomfort signals danger. Environmental crises reflect this dynamic. Damage accumulates slowly. Feedback is delayed. Responsibility is distributed. Action lags. Earlier systems may have avoided such overshoot simply because they could not ignore signals. Depletion was felt immediately. Collapse localized. The Lost Epoch may not have been ecologically ideal, but it was ecologically constrained. Constraints enforced learning. Modern systems loosen constraints through technology. This expands possibility. It also postpones learning. Postponed learning compounds cost. As cost accumulates, societies face choices. Slow down or double down. Reintegrate or further abstract. Restore feedback or reinforce control. These choices are rarely framed explicitly. They emerge through policy, culture, habit. The Lost Epoch offers no prescriptions. It offers contrast. Contrast reveals assumptions. One assumption that emerges clearly is the belief that complexity requires hierarchy. That order must be imposed from above. That coordination cannot emerge organically beyond small groups. Earlier human systems challenged this assumption. They coordinated without centralized control, through shared norms, through reputation, through continual negotiation. These mechanisms scale poorly, but they are robust locally. Modern interest in decentralized systems, networks, commons, peer governance, echoes this older logic. These interests arise not from nostalgia, but from practical limits of hierarchy at scale. Hierarchical systems excel at execution. They struggle with adaptation. Decentralized systems adapt well. They struggle with coherence. The Lost Epoch may represent a period when coherence emerged organically without hierarchy, because scale remained within certain bounds. Exceeding those bounds required new structures. Those structures solved immediate problems. They also introduced new vulnerabilities. Understanding these trade-offs is crucial as modern systems approach planetary scale. There is no larger container to absorb failure, no external environment untouched by consequence. In this context, the Lost Epoch becomes newly relevant, not as model but as reminder that different balances once existed. Balance between speed and sensitivity, between abstraction and embodiment, between growth and restraint. Restraint is particularly difficult in abundance. It requires internal limits rather than external scarcity. Earlier humans lived with external limits. Modern humans must learn internal ones. Learning internal limits is harder. It requires awareness of long-term consequence. It requires trust in collective action. It requires willingness to forego short-term gain. These qualities are not easily incentivized within current systems. Yet without them, overshoot continues. The Lost Epoch does not accuse. It illuminates. It suggests that human success has always depended on alignment between capacities and conditions. When alignment breaks, suffering follows, not immediately but inevitably. Modern suffering often appears disconnected from cause. Anxiety without threat, depression without deprivation. These conditions may reflect misalignment rather than pathology. If so, then addressing them requires more than treatment. It requires redesign of environments to restore coherence. Coherence is not simplicity, it is fit. Fit between body and rhythm, between action and effect, between knowledge and use. Earlier systems may have achieved fit through constraint. Modern systems must achieve it through design. Design informed by humility. Humility acknowledges that not all knowledge can be centralized, that not all processes can be optimized, that not all growth is benign. The Lost Epoch whispers this humility, not through instruction but through absence. As we approach the final parts, the focus turns toward integration, not returning to an earlier world, but weaving its lessons into the present. Because forgetting is not destiny, it is habit, and habits can be examined. The silence of the Lost Epoch is not empty. It is full of implication. Listening to it requires slowing down, accepting uncertainty, allowing questions without immediate answers. In doing so, something begins to reappear, not the past itself, but a way of attending to the present that the past once required. And perhaps that is enough to begin. There is a quiet resistance embedded in long silence, not a refusal, but a refusal to be simplified. The Lost Epoch resists being reduced to narrative because it unfolded without witnesses who could leave records in forms we recognize. Its knowledge moved through bodies, not through symbols fixed in place. When bodies vanish, the knowledge disperses. What remains is pattern. Patterns linger even when explanations fade. They surface in architecture that echoes proportions older than writing, in myths that mirror astronomical cycles too precise to be coincidence, in technologies that appear suddenly, already mature, without clear lineage. These patterns disturb linear models of progress. They imply accumulation without documentation, transmission without archive. One such disturbance appears in ancient construction. Massive stoneworks emerge across continents with strikingly similar principles: precision without modern measurement, alignment without written calculation, labor without centralized bureaucracy. Archaeology explains much through incremental development. Quarrying techniques, social organization, ritual motivation, these explanations are grounded and necessary. Yet gaps persist. Certain transitions remain abrupt. Techniques appear refined from their first instance. Styles emerge fully formed, then sometimes vanish. Vanishing is the key. Civilizations collapse, but not always in ways that preserve their most complex achievements. Fire destroys libraries. Stone endures, but not intent. Wood decays. Oral knowledge evaporates quickly once context breaks. The lost epoch may be defined less by what was built than by what was lost repeatedly. Cycles of loss shape history more than steady accumulation. Climate records confirm instability. Ice cores reveal sudden shifts. Droughts, floods, volcanic winters punctuate human timelines. Each event compresses survival margins. Each forces adaptation or abandonment. Adaptation under pressure prioritizes immediacy. Knowledge not directly useful is shed. Skills requiring continuity disappear. Thus, regression is not failure, it is strategy. The lost epoch may include periods of high sophistication followed by deliberate simplification. Not because complexity was unsustainable in principle, but because conditions no longer supported it. This reframes the notion of progress. Instead of a ladder, history resembles a pulse. Expansion and contraction, elaboration and pruning. Pruning preserves core function. Modern narratives often equate loss with decline. But loss can preserve viability. Shedding excess can enable survival. Earlier humans may have understood this intuitively, without ideology, without preservation bias. Their priority was continuity of life, not continuity of artifacts. Artifacts matter to historians because they persist. They distort perception by over-representing what lasts. The lost epoch may have left little because it optimized for resilience, not legacy. Legacy requires surplus. Surplus requires stability. Stability was intermittent. This does not diminish the intelligence of earlier humans. It highlights their pragmatism. Pragmatism shaped social structures as well. Leadership was likely fluid. Authority, situational. Expertise recognized but not institutionalized. Institutionalization preserves knowledge. It also fossilizes it. Fossilized knowledge resists adaptation. The lost epoch may have avoided fossilization by allowing knowledge to die when context changed. This kept systems light. It also increased vulnerability to forgetting. Modern systems overcorrect. They preserve everything. Data accumulates faster than meaning. Archives grow without integration. Integration requires time and attention. Attention is scarce. Scarcity of attention mirrors scarcity of resources in earlier eras. Both impose limits. Earlier limits constrained accumulation. Modern limits constrain comprehension. Comprehension fails when scale exceeds cognitive capacity. This failure manifests as abstraction fatigue. People disengage from systems they cannot grasp. Trust erodes. Conspiracy fills gaps left by opaque complexity. Conspiracy thrives where explanation is absent. The Lost Epoch reminds us that explanation once flowed naturally from participation. You knew how things worked because you were involved. Modern systems exclude most participants from meaningful involvement. They operate beyond view. This invisibility breeds suspicion. Suspicion is not irrational. It reflects a mismatch between responsibility and awareness. Earlier humans bore direct responsibility for outcomes. Their awareness matched their impact. Modern individuals often bear indirect responsibility. Their awareness lags behind impact. This lag strains ethics. Ethics evolved in contexts of visibility, when actions were seen, when harm was tangible, when feedback immediate. Applying those ethics to invisible systems is challenging. The Lost Epoch may offer insight into ethics grounded in presence rather than principle, care based on proximity rather than rule. Such ethics scale poorly, but they maintain coherence. Modern ethics rely on abstraction. Laws, rights, frameworks, these enable scale. They also distance decision-makers from consequences. Distance dulls moral intuition. This dulling necessitates enforcement. Enforcement replaces trust. Trust is difficult to rebuild once lost. Trust thrives in small groups with shared experience. Modern interest in localism reflects longing for trust, not rejection of complexity. The Lost Epoch did not solve trust, it embodied it. Embodiment is key. Knowledge embodied in practice adapts organically. Knowledge abstracted into text resists change. Text allows transmission across time and space. It also detaches knowledge from context. Context loss leads to misapplication. Misapplication accumulates error. The Lost Epoch may have avoided such error by limiting transmission beyond context. Knowledge stayed local. Local knowledge is precise. Global knowledge is general. Modern systems favor generality. They sacrifice nuance. Nuance matters for sustainability. Sustainability requires sensitivity to variation, to local conditions, to feedback. Global systems struggle with this sensitivity. As planetary challenges intensify, this struggle becomes evident. Climate responses falter not due to lack of data, but lack of alignment between data and behavior. Behavior changes when consequences are felt. Earlier humans felt consequences immediately. Modern humans feel them diffusely. The Lost Epoch suggests that reconnecting consequence to action is crucial. This does not require abandoning technology. It requires redesigning systems to restore feedback. Feedback can be social, environmental, emotional. Earlier systems integrated all three. Modern systems separate them. Reintegration is complex. It challenges existing power structures. Power concentrates when feedback weakens. Those benefiting from concentration resist reintegration. This resistance is structural, not malicious. Understanding this reduces moralization. It reframes conflict as misalignment rather than intent. The Lost Epoch invites this reframing. It softens judgment. It suggests that humanity has navigated misalignment before. Through contraction, through reorganization. These processes are painful. They involve loss. Loss is unavoidable. The question is what kind of loss occurs. Loss of artifacts or loss of coherence? Loss of complexity or loss of capacity to adapt? Earlier humans may have chosen complexity loss to preserve adaptability. Modern societies face similar choices, though framed differently. The Lost Epoch does not dictate choice. It contextualizes it. As we move closer to the end, attention turns toward what remains possible. Not recovery of the past, but recovery of sensitivity. Sensitivity to limits, to feedback, to consequence. Sensitivity that once guided humanity through uncertainty without written maps. Whether such sensitivity can be cultivated within modern systems remains uncertain. But uncertainty is not ignorance. It is awareness without resolution. And awareness is where listening begins. What lingers after silence is not emptiness, but echo. Echoes travel differently than voices. They bend around obstacles, soften with distance, yet retain enough shape to be recognized by those who listen closely. The Lost Epoch speaks mostly in echoes, not declarations, but resonances that surface unexpectedly, often where modern categories fail to explain them. One such resonance appears in sudden leaps of knowledge, moments when humanity seems to awaken with skills disproportionate to its documented preparation. Agriculture emerges rapidly in multiple regions. Metallurgy appears with surprising sophistication. Mathematics develops symbolic language that mirrors physical reality with uncanny precision. These developments are often described as inevitable, as if given enough time, complexity must arise. But inevitability is a comforting fiction. Time alone does not generate insight. Insight arises from conditions that allow sustained attention, experimentation, and transmission. When those conditions are absent, time erodes rather than builds. The Lost Epoch may represent periods when such conditions briefly aligned, then dissolved. Alignment is fragile. It depends on climate stability, social coherence, resource availability, and cultural values that prioritize curiosity over survival urgency. When these align, learning accelerates. When they fracture, learning stalls or reverses. Modern history records such accelerations clearly. The Renaissance followed demographic collapse. Scientific revolutions followed political upheaval. Innovation blooms in gaps left by disruption. Earlier gaps may have produced similar blooms, undocumented and later erased. Erasure does not require intent, it requires neglect. Knowledge not reinforced disappears quickly. Oral traditions can preserve astonishing detail, but only within living chains. Break the chain, and memory collapses. Written records extend chains, but only if preserved and interpreted correctly. Text without context becomes ambiguous. Ambiguity invites reinterpretation. Reinterpretation reshapes memory. Thus, history is not fixed. It is negotiated continuously. The Lost Epoch may have been renegotiated out of existence not through suppression, but through irrelevance. As new systems arose, old knowledge no longer fit prevailing frameworks. Frameworks select what counts as meaningful. What falls outside is dismissed as anomaly. Anomalies accumulate quietly. In archaeology, anomalies often appear as objects out of time, tools too advanced for their layers. Artistic skill without clear precursor. Astronomical alignments predating assumed observational capacity. Each anomaly invites explanation. Often, explanations resolve tension by adjusting timelines or questioning provenance. This is reasonable. Skepticism protects against error, but skepticism can also protect against revision. Revision threatens coherence. Coherence matters deeply to institutional knowledge. It provides stability, authority, predictability. Institutions prefer continuity over rupture. The Lost Epoch implies rupture. Rupture destabilizes linear narratives. Linear narratives underpin identity. They support beliefs about progress, purpose, and destiny. Questioning them evokes discomfort. Discomfort motivates dismissal. Thus, the Lost Epoch remains marginal, discussed at edges, framed as fringe, speculation, or coincidence. Yet its echoes persist. They persist in recurring myths of golden ages, of times when humans lived closer to truth, nature, or the divine. These myths appear globally, independently. They vary in detail but share structure, an earlier time of balance, followed by fall or forgetting. Myths are not records, but they encode experience. They compress complex transitions into symbolic form. Symbols endure because they are flexible. Flexibility allows survival across contexts. The lost epoch may survive primarily as symbol. Symbols guide behavior subtly. They shape values, fears, aspirations. Modern fascination with ancient wisdom reflects this pull. Not a desire to return, but a sense that something essential was misplaced. Misplacement differs from loss. What is misplaced can be rediscovered. Rediscovery requires openness. Openness challenges certainty. Certainty underpins authority. Authority resists openness. Thus, rediscovery often begins outside institutions, at margins, intersections, uncomfortable spaces between disciplines. Interdisciplinary inquiry disrupts silos. The lost epoch inhabits these disruptions. Geology intersects archaeology. Astronomy intersects mythology. Neuroscience intersects ritual. These intersections reveal patterns invisible within single fields. For example, ancient structures aligned with celestial events suggest sustained observation. Such observation implies long-term planning, record-keeping, and shared purpose. Shared purpose implies social stability. Stability contradicts assumptions about perpetual precarity in early eras. Perhaps precarity was episodic, not constant. Episodes of stability may have allowed deep cultural development. These episodes left traces. When instability returned, traces fragmented. Fragmentation obscures origin. Later, cultures inherit fragments without context. They reinterpret fragments within new frameworks. This process creates palimpsests. History becomes layered text, written over repeatedly. The lost epoch exists in underlying layers. Accessing it requires careful removal of overlays. This is delicate work. Remove too much, and meaning dissolves. Remove too little, and distortion remains. Balance is required. Balance is rare in polarized discourse. Polarization simplifies. Simplification accelerates communication but reduces nuance. Nuance is essential for understanding deep time. Deep time dwarfs human lifespan. Perspective shifts are required. The lost epoch challenges anthropocentrism. It suggests humanity has forgotten versions of itself. Not primitive versions, but alternative configurations. Configurations adapted to different constraints. Modern constraints differ, but adaptability remains relevant. Adaptability depends on learning from variation. Variation includes failure. Failure must be acknowledged. Modern cultures often conceal failure. Concealment prevents learning. Earlier cultures may have accepted failure as feedback. Feedback guided adjustment. Adjustment preserved continuity. Continuity mattered more than permanence. Modern societies invert this priority. Permanence is prized. Monuments, brands, institutions seek endurance. Endurance without adaptability leads to brittleness. Brittleness precedes collapse. The lost epoch may illustrate systems that avoided brittleness by avoiding permanence. This avoidance left fewer artifacts. Artifacts bias interpretation. We value what remains. We ignore what vanished. Vanishing may have been intentional. Intentional impermanence aligns with ecological awareness. Awareness of cycles discourages fixation. Fixation traps. The lost epoch may have embraced flow. Flow resists capture. Capture requires force. Force leaves evidence. Absence of evidence may indicate absence of force. This reframes absence itself as data. Silence speaks. What does prolonged silence suggest? Not ignorance, but restraint. Restraint rarely survives catastrophe, yet restraint may enable recovery. Recovery depends on seeds. Seeds are small, easily overlooked. The lost epoch may survive as seeds embedded in culture, instinct, and behavior. Seeds germinate when conditions permit. Modern conditions may be shifting. As complexity strains capacity, interest in foundational patterns grows. This interest is not regression. It is recalibration. The lost epoch offers no answers, but it sharpens questions. Questions open space. Space invites listening. Listening precedes understanding. Understanding unfolds slowly, and in that slowness, echoes become clearer. When echoes are followed long enough, they begin to overlap. One resonance intersects another, not perfectly, but with just enough alignment to suggest a shared origin. In these crossings, the lost epoch becomes less like a single forgotten chapter and more like a recurring pattern, appearing, dissolving, and reappearing under different names, climates, and assumptions. Patterns do not announce themselves. They must be inferred. One such pattern is the recurring presence of sudden discontinuity, not gradual decline but abrupt shifts where complex systems vanish and simpler ones replace them. The archaeological record shows this repeatedly. Dense urban networks collapse. Trade routes go silent. Writing systems disappear. Techniques once widespread become localized or lost entirely. These collapses are often explained by single causes: climate change, invasion, disease, overexploitation. Each explanation contains truth, yet none fully accounts for the scale of forgetting that follows. Forgetting is not automatic after collapse. It requires conditions that prevent reconstruction. After Rome fell, literacy declined in Western Europe, but not everywhere. In Byzantium and the Islamic world, knowledge persisted and expanded. Collapse did not erase memory universally. So why do earlier collapses seem more complete? One possibility lies in scale and infrastructure. Prehistoric knowledge systems may have been highly distributed, embedded in daily practice, rather than centralized in institutions. This made them resilient to small disruptions, but vulnerable to large ones. When large disruptions occurred, rapid climate shifts, megafaunal extinctions, sea level rise, the entire system of transmission may have fractured simultaneously. Sea level rise is particularly instructive. At the end of the last ice age, vast coastal areas were submerged. These areas likely supported dense populations due to abundant resources. Settlements, pathways, and ritual sites would have been lost beneath rising waters. Underwater archaeology has only begun to explore these zones. What lies submerged remains largely unknown. Unknowns invite speculation, but also humility. The absence of coastal records biases understanding toward inland survival narratives. Survivors tell history. Those displaced by the sea may have carried fragments of knowledge inland, but context would be altered. Practices suited to coastal ecologies may not translate easily. Loss accelerates when adaptation fails. Inland societies may have absorbed survivors selectively, privileging compatible skills. Incompatible knowledge fades. This selective retention reshapes culture. Reshaping can appear as innovation. Innovation may mask loss. Thus, what appears as progress may contain layers of forgetting. The lost epoch could represent coastal civilizations erased physically and culturally. If so, their absence is structural, not conspiratorial. Yet structural absence still distorts narrative. Narratives gravitate toward visible centers. What sinks leaves no voice. Silence accumulates. Silence becomes normalized. Normalization transforms absence into assumption. Assumption hardens into certainty. Certainty resists revision. Revision threatens authority. Authority stabilizes systems. Systems resist destabilization. Thus, the lost epoch remains peripheral. But peripheral does not mean irrelevant. Peripheries often preserve alternative perspectives. Margins host experiments. Experiments generate diversity. Diversity enables resilience. Modern systems struggle with resilience. Homogenization reduces adaptability. Ancient diversity may hold lessons. Lessons require interpretation. Interpretation depends on framework. Frameworks shape questions. Current frameworks prioritize material evidence. Material evidence favors permanence. Impermanent systems leave less trace. Trace-based methodologies underrepresent impermanent cultures. This methodological bias shapes conclusions. Bias is not moral failure, it is structural limitation. Acknowledging limitation expands inquiry. Expansion invites discomfort. Discomfort signals growth. The Lost Epoch sits at the edge of comfortable history. It asks whether absence can be evidence, whether silence can inform, whether gaps reveal as much as continuity. These questions challenge positivism. They invite integrative approaches. Integration blends science and humanities. Science provides measurement. Humanities provide meaning. Meaning contextualizes data. Without context, data misleads. The Lost Epoch requires context-sensitive reading. This reading resembles listening rather than decoding. Listening attends to nuance. Nuance emerges slowly. Slow inquiry contrasts with modern urgency. Urgency favors definitive answers. Definitive answers close questions. Closed questions halt exploration. The Lost Epoch resists closure. Its value lies in openness. Openness fosters humility. Humility supports ethical reflection. Ethics shape application of knowledge. Knowledge without ethics destabilizes systems. Ancient cultures may have embedded ethics within practice. Practice-oriented ethics leave fewer records. Records-oriented ethics leave texts. Texts outlast practices. Practices adapt. Adaptation preserves relevance. Texts preserve intent. Intent may become obsolete. Obsolete intent misguides application. Thus, textual dominance skews legacy. The Lost Epoch's lack of text may be its strength. Its lessons are not prescriptive. They are relational. They emphasize balance, feedback, responsiveness. These qualities align with ecological thinking. Ecological thinking is resurgent. Resurgence suggests unmet need. Need arises from mismatch. Mismatch between systems and environment. Ancient systems evolved under different constraints, yet principles may generalize. Principles endure beyond form. Form decays. Principle adapts. The Lost Epoch may transmit principles through myth, ritual, and instinct. Instinct bypasses language. Language constrains. Constraints simplify. Simplification loses depth. Depth requires immersion. Immersion requires time. Time is scarce. Scarcity limits reflection. Reflection enables integration. Integration fosters wisdom. Wisdom differs from knowledge. Knowledge accumulates. Wisdom balances. Balance sustains. The Lost Epoch may represent wisdom-rich, knowledge-light cultures. Modern societies are knowledge-rich, wisdom-poor. This imbalance generates tension. Tension manifests as crisis. Crisis forces reevaluation. Reevaluation revisits foundations. Foundations lie buried. Buried does not mean gone. They wait. Waiting requires patience. Patience is rare. Rare qualities are valuable. The Lost Epoch's rarity increases its significance, not as answer but as mirror. Mirrors reflect distortions. Distortions prompt correction. Correction restores alignment. Alignment enhances resilience. Resilience ensures continuity. Continuity matters. History teaches continuity through disruption. The Lost Epoch embodies this paradox. It endures through disappearance. Its absence shapes presence. Understanding this requires reframing. Reframing loosens grip on linearity. Linearity comforts, but comfort can mislead. The Lost Epoch unsettles. Unsettling invites growth. Growth demands letting go. Letting go opens space. In that space, echoes converge. They do not speak clearly. They do not instruct. They suggest. Suggestion is gentle. Gentleness invites attention. Attention awakens memory. Memory bridges gaps. Bridges span silence. And across that span, something familiar stirs. What follows a long silence is rarely clarity. More often, it is a quiet pressure, a sense that something unresolved continues to shape the present without ever naming itself. By the time echoes converge, they no longer feel ancient. They feel immediate, embedded in habits, assumptions, and the invisible architecture of modern thought. Civilizations do not simply inherit land, they inherit questions. One such question concerns scale. The Lost Epoch suggests that human societies once operated within limits that were not codified but felt. Limits shaped by ecology, mobility, and feedback that arrived quickly and unmistakably. When a system exceeded those limits, correction followed, not through ideology, but through consequence. Modern systems function differently. Scale expands faster than feedback. Decisions ripple outward, detached from immediate effect. Responsibility diffuses across institutions, timelines, and abstractions. Harm becomes statistical. Recovery becomes hypothetical. This is not moral judgment, it is structural observation. In such a world, memory behaves differently. Memory no longer resides primarily in bodies or landscapes. It migrates into archives, servers, databases, and models. These forms preserve information but weaken continuity of experience. Knowing becomes separate from living. The Lost Epoch appears to have fused the two. When knowledge is embodied, forgetting has consequence. A missed season, a misread pattern, a broken relationship. Correction is immediate. Learning is enforced gently but firmly. When knowledge is externalized, forgetting becomes survivable. Systems compensate. Errors accumulate slowly. Correction is delayed. Delay dulls urgency. Urgency shapes attention. Attention governs care. Care sustains systems. The erosion of care does not announce collapse. It manifests as drift. Drift is subtle. It feels like progress until thresholds are crossed. Thresholds are often invisible until exceeded. The Lost Epoch may have been acutely sensitive to thresholds, not through measurement, but through intimacy. Intimacy with land, weather, animals, and one another. This intimacy produced a different temporality. Time was not segmented into units of productivity. It was experienced as flow and return. Cycles anchored expectation. Disruption signaled anomaly. Modern time is linear, accelerated, fragmented. Fragmentation impedes pattern recognition. Pattern recognition supports anticipation. Anticipation enables restraint. Restraint maintains balance. Without balance, systems oscillate. Oscillation stresses structures. Stress reveals fragility. Fragility prompts control. Control reduces adaptability. Adaptability ensures survival. The Lost Epoch prioritized adaptability over control. This priority may explain its longevity. Tens of thousands of years without centralized authority, without writing, without permanent cities. This endurance challenges assumptions about progress. Progress is often equated with accumulation, but accumulation increases dependency. Dependency amplifies risk. Risk management shifts from responsiveness to prediction. Prediction relies on models. Models simplify reality. Simplification omits nuance. Nuance carries early warning. Without nuance, signals arrive late. Late signals precipitate crisis. Crisis invites drastic intervention. Intervention imposes rigidity. Rigidity resists change. The cycle tightens. The Lost Epoch's avoidance of this cycle may stem from its refusal to abstract excessively. Abstraction has power. It enables coordination at scale. It enables innovation. But abstraction also distances. Distance reduces accountability. Accountability requires visibility. Visibility requires proximity. Proximity was unavoidable in small-scale societies. Avoidance was limited. Conflict was personal. Resolution was necessary. Memory preserved reputation. Reputation shaped behavior. Behavior aligned with group survival. Group survival aligned with ecological balance. Balance was reinforced continuously. This reinforcement loop is difficult to recreate artificially. Modern systems attempt substitutes, laws, metrics, incentives. These substitutes approximate but do not replicate lived feedback. They operate symbolically. Symbols mediate reality. Mediation slows response. Slowness allows accumulation of error. The Lost Epoch's directness minimized mediation. Directness increases vulnerability but also clarity. Clarity enables learning. Learning refines practice. Practice evolves. Evolution occurs without rupture. Rupture erases. Erasure resets. Reset invites reinvention. Reinvention loses accumulated wisdom. The Lost Epoch may have optimized for slow evolution rather than rapid innovation. Modern culture often values the opposite. Rapid innovation outpaces integration. Integration lags. Lag creates imbalance. Imbalance necessitates correction. Correction often arrives as crisis. Crisis consumes attention. Attention narrows. Narrow focus sacrifices long-term perspective. Perspective sustains continuity. The Lost Epoch's continuity suggests a deep integration of perspective. Perspective anchored in place. Place anchored in memory. Memory anchored in relationship. Relationship anchored in reciprocity. Reciprocity sustains trust. Trust enables cooperation. Cooperation scales poorly without mediation. Thus, the transition to larger societies required new structures. These structures solved immediate coordination problems but altered feedback loops. Altered loops introduced new vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities accumulate invisibly. The Lost Epoch's absence from mainstream history may reflect discomfort with this trade-off. If earlier societies sustained themselves without hierarchy, writing, or surplus, then modern systems are not inevitable. They are contingent. Contingency invites choice. Choice invites responsibility. Responsibility challenges authority. Authority stabilizes narrative. Narratives legitimize power. Power resists destabilization. Thus, alternative histories remain marginal. Not suppressed overtly, but neglected. Neglect is quieter than censorship. Quiet omissions shape worldview. Worldview influences design. Design shapes future. The Lost Epoch's marginalization shapes expectations about what is possible. Possible futures are constrained by remembered pasts. If the past appears primitive, alternatives seem regressive. If the past appears sophisticated in different ways, alternatives expand. Expansion threatens established trajectories. Trajectory is comforting. Comfort reduces inquiry. Inquiry uncovers uncertainty. Uncertainty destabilizes. Stability is prized. Thus, silence persists. Yet silence is not emptiness. It is space. Space allows reflection. Reflection invites reinterpretation. Reinterpretation reframes evidence. Evidence may then speak differently. Underwater sites emerge. Genetic studies revise timelines. Climate models reveal abrupt shifts. Mythological parallels resurface. These signals converge slowly. They do not cohere into a single narrative. They form a field of possibility. Possibility resists closure. Closure simplifies. Simplification comforts. Comfort may mislead. The Lost Epoch asks for discomfort. Not anxiety, but openness. Openness tolerates ambiguity. Ambiguity fosters humility. Humility tempers ambition. Ambition unchecked destabilizes. The pattern returns. Perhaps the Lost Epoch is not a single lost civilization. Perhaps it is a mode of living, a mode that fades and reappears, a mode that resists monumentality, a mode that leaves few traces but many descendants. Its descendants may be found in practices that emphasize listening, reciprocity, and restraint. They appear sporadically across cultures. They are often marginalized. They persist quietly. Quiet persistence defines resilience. Resilience outlasts spectacle. The Lost Epoch's quiet endurance may be its greatest legacy. Not a blueprint, not a myth, but a reminder. A reminder that scale is not synonymous with success. That complexity requires care, that forgetting has consequences, and that history's most influential chapters may be the ones least recorded. The final layer does not arrive as revelation. It settles slowly, like dusk lowering itself over a familiar landscape, changing nothing and everything at once. What remains after so much tracing of absence is not an answer, but a posture, a way of standing in relation to the past without insisting that it resolve itself. The lost epoch has never demanded belief. It has only asked for attention to the spaces between artifacts, to the pauses in stratigraphy, to the long intervals where humanity leaves almost no durable mark, yet somehow endures. These intervals are often described as empty, but endurance contradicts emptiness. Endurance implies sufficiency. Sufficiency suggests balance. Balance requires calibration. Calibration depends on feedback. Feedback must be felt. The lost epoch seems to have felt deeply, not sentimentally but structurally. It felt weather through skin, hunger through rhythm, cooperation through proximity, danger through sound. It felt consequence without translation. This immediacy shaped cognition. Cognition shaped culture. Culture shaped survival. Survival reinforced cognition. A closed loop, refined over millennia. When that loop was interrupted, by settlement, by surplus, by abstraction, new loops formed. These new loops enabled growth but weakened immediacy. They replaced feeling with representation, presence with record, listening with management. Management extends reach. Reach extends influence. Influence dilutes responsibility. Responsibility requires proximity. Proximity is costly at scale. Thus, scale trades intimacy for efficiency. Efficiency accelerates. Acceleration narrows tolerance. Narrow tolerance increases fragility. Fragility invites control. Control ossifies systems. Ossified systems resist correction. Correction arrives as collapse. Collapse resets. Reset erases memory. The cycle repeats. The lost epoch may have escaped this cycle not through wisdom, but through limitation, through constraints that prevented runaway accumulation and abstraction, through smallness that enforced care. Care is difficult to systematize. It arises from relationship. Relationship requires time. Time slows when movement matters. Movement was central. When movement slowed permanently, something else had to compensate. Symbols emerged. Property emerged. Boundaries hardened. Time segmented. Work separated from life. Life separated from land. Land separated from story. Story separated from practice. Practice separated from meaning. Meaning migrated upward. Upward meanings demand enforcement. Enforcement demands authority. Authority demands legitimacy. Legitimacy demands narrative. Narrative simplifies. Simplification omits cost. Cost accumulates silently. Silence returns. The lost epoch resides in this silence, not as a hidden truth waiting to be revealed, but as a contrast that exposes assumptions. Assumptions about progress, about inevitability, about what constitutes success. If humanity once persisted for tens of thousands of years without collapsing its ecological base, then collapse is not intrinsic to intelligence. It is a feature of certain arrangements. Arrangements can change. Change begins with recognition. Recognition requires remembering. Remembering does not require romanticizing. It requires accuracy tempered by humility. The lost epoch was not idyllic. It involved suffering, loss, and vulnerability. But vulnerability was visible. It was shared. It was addressed collectively or not at all. Modern vulnerability is often hidden. Hidden vulnerability accumulates. Accumulated vulnerability erupts. Eruption surprises. Surprise destabilizes trust. Trust erosion fractures societies. Fragmentation accelerates decline. The Lost Epoch offers no solution, but it reframes the problem. The problem may not be insufficient control, but insufficient feedback. Not insufficient innovation, but insufficient integration. Not insufficient knowledge, but insufficient attention. Attention cannot be automated. It cannot be delegated indefinitely. It demands presence. Presence is resource-intensive. Thus, systems avoid it. Avoidance creates distance. Distance creates abstraction. Abstraction creates blindness. Blindness invites error. Error compounds. Compounding overwhelms. Overwhelm prompts drastic action. Action without understanding worsens imbalance. The loop closes. Breaking the loop may require reinserting presence at critical points. Not everywhere, but where consequence matters most. This is difficult. It requires resisting scale for its own sake, resisting speed without direction, resisting accumulation without purpose. These resistances appear regressive within dominant narratives, yet endurance favors them. The Lost Epoch endured, not unchanged but coherent. Coherence emerges from alignment, alignment between body and environment, between action and outcome, between memory and place, between individual and group, between need and restraint. Modern systems struggle with alignment. They excel at reach. Reach without alignment exhausts. Exhaustion manifests as crisis. Crisis accelerates forgetting. Forgetting repeats the cycle. Thus, remembering becomes an act of care. Not remembering facts alone, but remembering ways of relating. Ways that do not translate easily into policy or infrastructure. Ways that operate quietly. Quiet operations are undervalued. They leave few metrics. Few metrics attract little funding. Little funding limits adoption. Adoption remains marginal. Marginal practices persist in niches. Niches preserve diversity. Diversity buffers systems. Buffers absorb shock. Shock frequency increases. Buffers become critical. The Lost Epoch may function as a conceptual buffer, a reminder that alternatives have existed, that humanity is capable of sustaining itself without total domination of its environment, that intelligence need not culminate in maximal extraction, that meaning can emerge without permanence. These reminders challenge prevailing trajectories. Trajectory defines momentum. Momentum resists redirection. Redirection requires friction. Friction generates heat. Heat signals effort. Effort is avoided when comfort prevails. Comfort delays adaptation. Delayed adaptation narrows options. Narrow options heighten risk. Risk reframes priorities. Perhaps that is why the Lost Epoch feels closer during times of strain. Not because it returns, but because its contrast sharpens. As modern systems approach limits, ecological, psychological, social, the assumptions underlying them become visible. Visibility invites questioning. Questioning unsettles certainty. Certainty anchors power. Power resists questioning. Resistance intensifies strain. Strain accelerates change. Change arrives regardless of preparedness. Preparedness depends on memory. Memory of alternatives. Memory of trade-offs. Memory of costs paid and avoided. The Lost Epoch is memory without record. Record without monument. Monument without instruction. Instruction without doctrine. Doctrine without authority. Authority without enforcement. Enforcement without permanence. Permanence was never its aim. Perhaps that is why it lasted. In the end, the Lost Epoch does not demand recovery. It cannot be recovered. It asks whether the present is willing to listen, not to replicate but to recalibrate, not to return but to reorient, to notice where scale has outrun care, where abstraction has eclipsed consequence, where speed has displaced sense. These notices are quiet. They do not trend. They do not promise certainty. They ask for patience. Patience has fallen out of favor. Yet patience underwrote survival long before progress was named. If humanity is again approaching thresholds, climatic, technological, social, then patience may regain relevance, not as delay, but as attentiveness. Attentiveness to signals before they become crises. attentiveness to limits before they are enforced, attentiveness to relationships before they fracture. The lost epoch survives as a whisper beneath the noise, not instructing, not warning loudly, simply present, waiting to be heard.